Welcome back to the foundation course in managerial economics. I am Dr. Barnali Nag from VGSOM IIT Kharagpur. We had started off with discussing about demand and supply, and then we went ahead to discuss about what elasticity is. And if you may remember, we had started the entire discussion on elasticity with talking about what does a producer do when he is in the dilemma whether to increase his price or not, because from the law of demand he knows that if he increases the price, the quantity demanded is going to go down, but he would like to know if the reduction is in quantity is going to be compensated by the increase in price. That is, how responsive quantity demanded is to price is what he is looking for. So, to continue with that discussion, we are going to show here in this lecture how price elasticity is related to the revenue that a producer may expect when he is changing the price of his product. So the question basically that we are asking is, what happens to total revenue when I raise the price? Now, since total revenue is equal to price multiplied by quantity, total revenue may increase from rise in price, or total revenue may fall from fall in quantity. So, from this equation of total revenue equals price into quantity, there are two components, price and quantity, and whenever there is any change in price, quantity moves in the opposite direction. So, the question is, how much is the increase or decrease in price, and related to that, how much is the decrease or increase in quantity respectively, the two cases. So, what happens depends on price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand is going to tell us that what happens when price changes. Is the price effect more or the quantity effect more? So, to continue with the discussion and to illustrate a little more, price elasticity and total revenue. So, price elasticity, again going back to the definition of price elasticity, is percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price, and revenue is P multiplied by Q. So, whenever we have a inelastic demand, that is elasticity is less than 1, that implies that the numerator is smaller than the denominator in the very first line where we have defined price elasticity. So, elasticity less than 1 implies percentage change in quantity is less than percentage change in price. So, when price rises, total revenue falls from decline in quantity, and that decline is less than the total revenue, the increasing impact of price increase that happens on total revenue. That is, when it is an inelastic demand, the quantity effect or the fall in revenue from a fall in quantity is less than the increase in revenue from increase in price. And similarly, when price falls, it is exactly the opposite effect, that is, revenue increase from quantity increase is actually less than revenue decrease from price decrease. So, what does that mean? That means to say that if it is an inelastic demand, it makes sense to increase the price, because when you are increasing the price increase, the impact of the price increase increases total revenue, and that increase is more than the fall in quantity that happens because price has risen, and the fall in quantity pulls down the total revenue, but that impact is less than the impact of a rise in prices. So, in a nutshell, it makes sense to increase the price when it is inelastic demand. Okay, so let me illustrate through a diagram also. So, let me illustrate through a diagram. So, this is the case of a elastic demand curve. So, this is a very elastic demand curve where price elasticity is more than 1. So, this is a elastic demand curve, and when price falls, this is P1, this is Q1, and there is a fall in price. The producer decides that I am going to reduce the price. So, the price falls to P2 and the quantity falls to Q2. Now, before the price fall, what is the total revenue? Total revenue is P multiplied by Q, which is this area. This is the revenue 1. This is the portion that the producer was earning as revenue before there was any price change. But when price fell to P2 and quantity increased to Q2, first of all we can see that the quantity increase here, this is more than the price fall, which is shown by this portion. Also, what is the new revenue? The new revenue is this area. This is P2 into Q2, and this is the new revenue. So, the additional amount of revenue that the producer gets is this area, and the revenue that he has foregone by reducing the price is this area. So, it looks like from the figure, at least it shows that this rectangle is larger than this rectangle. So, the area under this rectangle is larger than the area under this rectangle, which kind of shows that if it is the flatter the slope is, the more the revenue is earned when price falls. So, in the case of a elastic demand. So, let me draw the case of a inelastic demand. What happens in the case of a inelastic demand? So, this is P and this is a steep, or elasticity is less than 1. This is inelastic demand. So, in the case of inelastic demand, the same price fall, this is P1, Q1, and price falls to P2 and quantity increases to Q2. Here the additional revenue that the producer gets is this very narrow rectangle, and the amount that he foregoes is this upper rectangle. So through the figures, it is kind of intuitively it can be shown graphically that the amount of revenue gained when there is a price fall through increase in revenue is much lesser in case of a inelastic demand. So, this was illustration through diagram. Let me also complete the discussion by using a little bit of calculus. So, using calculus, now revenue, as we wrote earlier, is P multiplied by Q. Now, we would like to see what happens to revenue when there is price change. So, this we can write as, and also let us write the definition of elasticity of demand in terms in mathematical form. This is dq dp multiplied by P by Q, that is change in quantity divided by percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. This is elasticity of demand. So, whenever there is price change, then dr dp can be written as Q plus d plus Q, P into dq dp, or taking the q out, it can be written as 1 plus P by Q into dq dp, and this portion is nothing but the elasticity of demand. So, this is equal to 1 plus elasticity of demand. So, it is very clear from here what happens to change in revenue is more or less than the existing revenue is very clear from this expression. So, when it is a inelastic demand and price elasticity of demand being less than 0, price elasticity of demand, this is always negative. So, elasticity of demand is always negative, and when this expression, when it is a inelastic demand, there is a increase in quantity. This is a positive expression. When inelastic demand implies elasticity of demand is less than 1, and elastic demand implies elasticity of demand is more than 1. So, in case of elastic demand, when elasticity is more than 1, this expression becomes negative, or in other words, when there is a price change, the revenue change happens in the opposite direction. So, what is the intuition behind it? The intuition behind it all, whatever we showed graphically through calculus and through by reasoning, the intuition behind this is basically that if it is a inelastic demand, say for example, we took the example of say medicine, life-saving medicine. So, it has a very inelastic demand. So, what happens when price changes? When price increases, people are not going to cut back on consumption too much, because it is a necessity, they have to buy it in any case. So, that is the reason when price increases, the quantity reduction or cut in quantity demand is not so much, so the revenue increases in case of a inelastic demand when price increases, and the opposite thing happens when price falls. When price falls, in normal circumstances, or the law of demand says that when price falls, consumption is going to increase. But here what is happening in case of inelastic demand, which is a necessary good, and in most cases necessary goods are something which you consume in a certain given amount. So in most of the circumstances, in necessary goods, it's a inelastic demand, where if price falls, you are not going to increase your consumption too much. So in that case, the quantity effect, or the effect of increase in quantity because price has fallen, that does not happen so much, and so it does not make much sense to reduce the price. And exactly the opposite thing happens in case of a elastic demand. Elastic demand, we took the example of luxury goods, say, and in case of luxury goods, you can imagine if the price falls, you would like to take the advantage and consume more. But if there is a price increase, it's not a necessary good, and you can just as well give it up for some time, or cut down your consumption, or postpone your consumption. It's much more flexible, and because it is flexible, it is a elastic demand. So this was our discussion on inelastic demand and what that does to revenue. And let's end the discussion with a typical case. This example is given in one of the textbooks that I have recommended, Principles of Economics by Mankiw, and I have borrowed this example from there. And this case says, does drug interdiction help reducing drug related crimes? So there are basically, you can imagine two policies to control drug use. Say for example, you would like to obviously you would strongly like to reduce the use of drugs among youngsters, among people, among your citizens, And what can you do for that? One is you could use a very strict method of interdiction, very severe punishments if you are caught with drugs. And second is you could create awareness. So, we are going to take this example of elasticity, supply, demand, whatever we have learned so far, to see what happens in each of these cases. Now, slightly to illustrate the example, we also assume that the total value of drug related crime is equal to total revenue from sale of drugs. So, we are trying to quantify that what is the impact of each of these policies, and how do we quantify? First, we quantify if we are talking about drug related crimes, what is the measure of that? Maybe the measure we can take the assume that the measure is the amount of drug that is sold, or the amount of expenditure that people do on drugs by buying drugs, or the amount of revenue that the drug vendors or peddlers they earn by selling the drugs. And drugs are addictive, hence they are necessary to users. So, they are addictive. So, one might assume that the consumers of drug the people who consume the drugs are not so much price sensitive. That is, no matter what the price of the drug is, they would nevertheless like to buy the drugs. So, the drugs, we can assume that it has a very inelastic demand curve. So, now let us see what happens in each of the two cases. Now, if in the case of the first policy of interdiction, as we discussed in the earlier classes, that whenever any disturbance in the system is introduced or proposed, how do we figure out that what happens in the market? To figure that out, what was the first step? The first step was that we have to find out which of the two demand and supply graphs does this impact. So, here there is interdiction, or there is a strong message to the people that there is severe punishment if you are caught selling drugs. So, in that case, what happens? Which of the two demand and supply, which of the two curves is affected? Obviously, the supply curve is affected. So, if there is interdiction, there is a supply curve is affected, there is fear among the sellers of drugs, and it probably is successful in cutting down the supply of drugs, that less people are willing to sell drugs. Or maybe they are more they are selling the same drugs probably, but for them the cost has gone up. They have to be even more careful, and so the price for the cost at which they can sell the drugs, that goes up, and when cost goes up, what happens? So, first let us draw the demand curve for drugs. So, it is a very steep demand curve where inelasticity, it is an inelastic demand curve and elasticity of demand is less than 1. And this is the demand curve for drugs, and say this was the supply curve. This was the initial supply curve, and this was the initial price and quantity. This was the equilibrium initially. Now, there is interdiction. So, when interdiction happens, what happens? The supply curve shifts to the left. So, it is costlier for the suppliers to supply the drugs. So, when supply curve has shifted to the left, price increases and quantity falls. So, yes, the policy is successful in reducing the amount of drugs sold to the community. So, the amount falls from Q1 to Q2. But we have measured the drug related crime as the total revenue or the total amount of drug trading that is happening in the economy. So, we can see clearly from here that this is the revenue that is foregoing, that the drug sellers are foregoing, and this is the additional revenue that they are getting because drug has become more expensive. And from here we can clearly see that this is a bigger rectangle. This is a bigger rectangle, and you can probably do this yourself and try to see, like try to draw the demand curve steep or flat and try to do this, and you will clearly see that the revenue actually increases in this case. So the revenue actually increases in this case, or in other words, here the price increase that happens because supply has fallen actually leads to lesser fall in quantity. The fall in quantity is not so much because it's inelastic demand, and as a result the amount of drug related crimes, the way we have measured the drug related crimes, that actually goes up. And this is the example of interdiction. Now what happens in the case of awareness? If you are creating awareness, what happens in that case? There also you have a steep demand curve D1 and a supply curve S1. Now in case of awareness, which of the two curves is affected? In case of awareness, where are you creating the awareness? You are basically creating the awareness among people who use the drugs. So when awareness goes up, the demand for drugs goes down. So when demand for drugs goes down, the demand curve shifts to the left. So this is the new demand curve, and in this case the earlier equilibrium was P1 Q1 and the new equilibrium is P2 Q2. So not only has the quantity demanded fallen, the price has also fallen because demand has fallen, and in total the PQ has fallen. PQ is much less than the initial PQ. So P1 here, so P2 is less than P1, Q2 is less than Q1, and P1 Q1 is much more than P2 Q2, which shows that in case of awareness, when you create awareness, let me write it here, maybe its camera is, this is blocking the camera, and so in the second case, in case of the awareness, what is happening is P1 is more than P2, Q1 is more than Q2, and P1 Q1 is more than P2 Q2. So the new revenue is much less than the earlier revenue. So this basically shows that this is a very interesting example of how elasticity can be applied, and how the shift in demand and supply curves, the discussion that we started with in the first place, that can be illustrated through this kind of example. So this example basically shows that if it is an inelastic demand curve and there is so a change in the supply as against a change in demand actually creates less impact in case of a inelastic demand curve. And to end the discussion, another point which is worth noting is when the supply changes, movement is along the demand curve. Movement is along the demand curve, and when demand changes, movement is along the supply curve, which means to say that when supply changes, the consumers feel the impact of change in prices and they respond along the demand curve, and when demand changes or demand shifts, the suppliers feel the price change and they respond to the price change, and they do that against the or along the supply curve. So, so that ends our discussion on elasticity of demand and how it can be used to explain changes in revenue. And when a producer decides whether to change the price or not, the producer needs to understand what would be the impact of a price change on the total revenue that he can expect, because he knows, the producer knows that the producer knows the law of demand, and the producer knows that there is a negatively sloping demand curve that he is facing, and whenever there is a change in price, that is going to reduce that is going to change the quantity as well. So that ends our discussion. We are going to talk about supply in the elasticity of supply in the next lecture. Thank you.